morning and welcome to Focus on the News. We have John Tigges back with us today. John, good to have you here.
Great.
And again, we have Caitlin Moon, who is very popular on the show, and it's nice to have you, Caitlin.
Good to be back.
Yeah, we're gonna talk a little bit of law towards the end of the show, and I know you've been reading up on the federal cases affecting the student loan forgiveness, so we'll get into that. But I think first of all, we need to just sort of generally talk about the elections and where we stand, what lessons we might have learned from it. John, you wanna kick us off a little bit on that?
Well, the election is far from over, as best I can tell. We're still almost a week into this, and we still don't know the results. Although, very interesting change from Tuesday night. I feel a lot like I did in 2020, where it just seems like as you go longer, the more votes continue to eke out of the system that seem to consistently favor Democrats. And I think a lot of people are starting to go into shock that we've been foiled again. And I think a lot of people are going to have to start asking some really, really hard questions about what the way ahead is. Certainly, we're seeing a lot of people in the blame game already, blaming Trump for being a bad guy, blaming bad candidates, blaming this, blaming that, blaming whatever. And don't see thus far any real leadership in trying to figure out a solution. Where do you think it goes from here?
You really touch a sensitive nerve when you talk about this argument of candidate quality. Mitch McConnell was the one who raised that issue. He said, "Well, we don't have the right quality candidate." Are you kidding me, Mitch? My goodness, the Democrats pick Fetterman, a guy who, I got to tell you, he looks like all of the classical pictures I've ever seen, all the paintings of Satan, and he's got the character to go along with it. I mean, this is a guy who has tattoos all over his body and
horns growing out of his neck.
He's oh my gosh, I could go on and on, but he's a guy who basically lived off his parents up until the 40s. He was in his 40s, never achieved anything, and he said, I think he said that if he had one wish in all the world, it would be to free murderers from prison. So when Mitch McConnell talks about candidate quality, I am unimpressed by him. I think he was a poor candidate back when he was elected. What do you think, Caitlin? Do you have what are your initial ruminations?
I think it's very similar to most conservatives and Republicans across the nation right now. I think we're all a little bit in shock. No one expected this to happen, especially with the Senate race in Pennsylvania, talking about candidate quality. John Fetterman, if we look at the debates, he really did struggle to put together thoughts and ideas that voters could take as his values and his issue stances. I think if we're looking at Fetterman's support, excuse me, I think a lot of his votes came in before the debate with early voters. That's something we saw across the nation. Democrats dominated early voting statistics. So, there's a lot to look at. I mean, to sum it all up, I'm in shock. It was unexpected. We'll just have to see how the last few remaining races turn out, and we'll just have to go from there and keep fighting.
Well, if you remember before my last episode I was here, I was hopeful, but I was concerned that this is exactly what would happen. And the reason we expect it is because nothing's changed for the most part in most states that have these corrupt systems. There's so many ways to cheat, so many ways. Certainly the early voting is a huge problem. And there's almost no transparency over the counting process, at least at the polls. There's some sort of oversight, but in most states, there's just no transparency. They can come up with whatever they want, count whatever they want, and guess who is doing the counting? It's exactly what Stalin said. It's not how many who votes, it's who counts the votes. So we've got it there. We've got it in the total amount of votes that can be collected and unverified. We have it in the voting systems themselves. There's, in most cases, 6 points where a system can be hacked as it gets tabulated. I mean, we have a completely unsafe, unverifiable, untrustworthy voting system. And unfortunately, in the worst places like Philadelphia, it's completely controlled still by Democrats. And I mean, we got a real serious question to ask. A lot of people, like I saw Ned Ryan and Ben Domenech advocating that we need to, start to play their game. We need to go with ballot harvesting. That's called cheating. And I think for a lot of conservatives, they're going to have a problem with that. We want to cheat better than the Democrats, and then proclaim that we're going to be the moral party. It's a real dilemma, and I'd be really interested, with all your years of experience, Senator, what your thoughts are on what the options are going ahead.
Well, I think the media has, they censored any discussion of the voter fraud. A lot of people were taken off the air because they dared to talk about specific.
Well, in our state here in Virginia, Senator Chase was censured by the Republican Party for saying that 2020 was a fraud. We had our own Republican Party that won't want to talk about it here in Virginia. I mean, we got a serious problem when the people most affected are being affected by the narrative, and they're not willing to take the leadership to deal with the obvious problem that took place. Let's go back. Did Biden get 81 million votes? There's no way.
No.
There was clearly voter fraud in 2020, and we're not willing to deal with that. I'm sorry, press on, but I mean, we have to look in the mirror a little bit here as well.
Very few Americans are aware of this, but the United States has a long, storied history of voter fraud. This is not something that just sort of popped up out of nowhere. We had Huey Long was notorious for all of the Louisiana voter corruption and that kind of thing. And one of the most interesting, Lyndon Johnson changed the direction of America in the most fundamental ways when he was the president. But he began his career through voter fraud. Lyndon Johnson, back in 1948, he was running for U.S. Senate from Texas. And this was in the Democrat primary. And he had an opponent who defeated him, a narrow margin, but solid victory. And then they began the work on examining, where they could come up with the extra votes they needed. And there was an area that was very heavily controlled by a big local boss. And all of a sudden, they discovered uncounted ballots. It sounds like today, doesn't it? And they came up with what was called Magic Box 13. Magic Box 13 had the number of ballots that was required to shift the vote. And when they looked at it, it turned out that unlike a normal ballot box that would, just have all of these ballots thrown in, you had ballots that were literally in alphabetical order. And they were all written back then they were all made out by hand. You know, you'd have a pen or pencil, whatever. Everyone was made with the same distinctively colored pen in the same identical handwriting. And so the guy who you know, the vote then shifted to Lyndon Johnson. The other fellow took it to federal court. Federal judge looked at it, said, "This is obviously fraudulent." He tossed him out. And then through some legal machinations, they got up to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court said, "Oh no, that's a local issue," which very conveniently threw the election to Lyndon Johnson, who later on was he was in Dallas. He controlled Dallas. He controlled Texas. He was there when John Kennedy was assassinated, which made him the president. And now, not to take John Kennedy off the hook, John had clearly set the stage for us going into Vietnam. But Lyndon Johnson was the guy who put it on hyperdrive and sent us off to war.
Oh, and Kennedy clearly was elected through fraudulent means in Chicago. The votes he needed came. I mean, you're right. It's been going on for a long time. But here we are now. We're in a world in which now it's on such a massive scale. I mean, there's like 34 states that have early voting. And you know, in most cases, the only way to turn that back is to have both houses approve it and have a veto-proof majority against the governor. So do we join? We play the game. We start ballot harvesting like the Democrats. We start rigging the counters so that you can have people magically count things and throw things out like it's going on with Kerry Lake. You know, what is the way ahead? Is there an obvious path to solving a completely corrupt and subverted election system?
Well, I'm not going to get into recommending that people do anything that violates the law, but I will say this: we have to deal with the laws that we have in effect. And I think one thing that perhaps cost us a few very close seats, I think Republicans generally had a consensus that in order to try to undermine the voter fraud, we needed to avoid early voting and vote on the day of the election. I think that in retrospect, I think it's cost us a few seats, because what you have, you kind of are stuck with the election laws that are in place. If you don't vote until the day of the election, what happens is suddenly your grandmother gets sick. You've got to fly off and you got to take care of her. So you don't get to vote. The boss says, "Hey, look, we've got a crisis at our office up in New York City. I got to put you on a plane. You got to go. You can't vote." All of these, I mean, there are thousands and thousands of people who are affected by this. And so it gives an advantage to the Democrats who have voted in advance, so that when they have somebody who has sickness in the family, they've already voted. That's tallied up. So I think this is an issue that we're going to have to think about, and this is one that's within the bounds of law, that where we can make some difference. But at this point, it looks as though the Democrats have control of the Senate now. They may get control of the House, because initially it looked like absolutely a bridge too far for the Democrats, because even though we hadn't won a large majority, there was no way that they could possibly make up the difference. We only needed a small number of additional seats to be ruled in our favor. Excuse me. But the Democrats needed a huge number of additional seats in order to take over. The problem with early voting generally is that once it's in, the Democrats know how many votes they need, and then they can produce those. And maybe they'll get real people, maybe they'll get people from the grave, maybe they'll just manufacture people. So we're put in a quandary, but I think on balance, we need to be voting early if that's the rule. But I worry about the House. When I looked at it, I said, okay, well, this is what we've got. That's what they've got. If half the undecideds go our way and half go their way, there's no way they can take the House. Well, that's not the way that it worked. The longer it drags on, the greater the opportunity for fraud. And I think if you look at Maricopa County, which is it's sort of the epicenter of fraud. I mean, the only reason we know the name Maricopa County is because of fraud. Yeah. And here I don't know what goes on. I mean, Florida got their election tally in the night of the election, finished, big state. Here you got Arizona, small state, and weeks and weeks are going on. So
we know what's going on. It's the same thing that happened. I mean, the audits that went in there afterwards were able to show they couldn't prove fraud because it's such a high standard, but the inconsistencies, the equal amounts across precincts that showed up in votes, the people moving, voting literally hundreds of miles away from their precinct. It was just ridiculous. And it's going on again. They know how to pull the levers. And I think what bothers me, Senator, is that even if we get people to vote early and we pick up a few percentage points that way, they figured out how to wait this out and keep pulling the levers, whether it's through finding more magic boxes number 13 or whether it's in the systems themselves, in the tabulations. I mean, we saw even here in Loudoun County, we saw Hung Cow go suddenly lose almost 70,000 votes. I mean, there's plenty of screenshots of it. It's happening in lots of places. There is no trust in the voting system. And I don't know, that we have a good solution. And with the laws that are in place, it's really stacked against us. It's like trying to, go into a gambling casino and think you're going to come out lucky. At some point, the odds are against you. They're just completely stacked. And it's really, really, it's a really challenging time. And we have a Republican leadership that doesn't want to talk about it. What do you do about that? It seems to me that one thing is clear is that you don't have leadership in the Republican Party. There has to be a massive change. Some people are now, pushing for DeSantis. Other people are saying, hey, wait a minute, Trump is still the kingpin maker. He actually was pretty successful where he made endorsements, minus the awful choice of Oz. But I'm not sure if he'd put someone else in there. I mean, if you can get a Neanderthal elected, they're going to elect the Neanderthal regardless of your choice. I mean, it's really, really serious time for our country. If we would actually speak up and recognize the fact that our election system has been subverted, we've lost our country.
Well, that may be. I think all we can do. We just have to keep pushing forward. I always say that despair is a vice and hope is a virtue. So we just follow traditional Christian principles. We'll keep hoping and we'll keep trying and keep praying and see what we can do.
Well, let's go there, because I think that is a really good point. Is if we are a Christian nation, how is it that so few people are speaking up? If people really believe there is resident evil going on and subversion, why is it that people are not speaking? We are commanded to speak up for those that can't speak up for themselves. And the majority of Christians have been silent in the midst of what clearly is a problem, whether it's the perversion that we've talked about many times, or whether it's this obvious subversion of our Constitution. Most Christians, I think, have to look in the mirror, and instead of blaming Trump or McConnell or someone else, I think they got to blame themselves. If you didn't speak up in the last few years, if you haven't been boldly involved in trying to make a change in this and be willing to identify what it clearly is subversion, then you're to blame. And you need to take a stock of yourself instead of, putting your hope in some political figure. If enough people, there's enough evidence to show in so many situations, just a small percentage of the population, if they would join together and band together and speak as one, you can change the entire country. And I believe ultimately this is not a political solution. It is a faith solution. And it's going to require people to, on their knees, admit the wickedness in their own heart, their complicity in the problem. And ultimately, we have to call upon a holy God and purify ourselves in our actions. And that's why this whole concept of diving in and being a better cheater than the Democrats, to me, is so just distasteful. It's not the solution. We have to ultimately look in the mirror and readdress our own actions. And that we can have hope in, because we do have a God that's a lot bigger than all of this.
Well, agreed. Well, I'd like to shift to our last topic here, where we have had a victory in the courts. And Caitlin, you want to give us a rundown on this?
Sure. I also want to give a response to the previous topic we were just talking about. I completely agree that the state of our union is going to need a faith-based solution and remedy. I think there's two things that's infiltrated our country. One, the secularization of virtually every aspect of government and civil society. God is no longer in our schools. God is no longer in our government. God is gone. And I think Democrats have done a very good job of getting rid of him. It's obviously working in their favor. So one, we need to stop secularizing our country. This is a country born on Judeo-Christian values, and we need to return to that. Two, we've also allowed, as Christians and as the body of Christ, we've allowed the spirit of fear to infiltrate this country. If we look back at the past 2 years, we've allowed government, bureaucrats, political, unelected officials convince us to be afraid of a virus and to stay in our homes and to just live with it and be okay with it. And they weaponize fear to do this. We are not called to live in fear. The body of Christ needs to stand up in this country and stop being afraid, because we are called to a higher calling, and we're not under the authority of fear. We're under the authority of God. So stop secularizing our schools and our government and our civil society. And two, stop living in fear. We're not called to do that. So that's my response.
Preach it, sister. Preach it.
Well, yeah, Caitlin for president. And I'll just finalize that. I would suggest that our churches have to do a much better role. The Christian churches, all of them preach the message of salvation. The problem is, what are you being saved from? And they don't like to talk about sin. They don't like to talk about right and wrong. I'm Roman Catholic, and but we've got a pope who comes out and he's condemning populism. In other words, you ought to knuckle under to the global one world order. This is a pope who had the Pachamama idol brought into Vatican City, and when some faithful Catholics took the stupid idol and threw it into the Tiber River, he had it recovered, and he was just livid that anyone would desecrate the Pachamama fertility idol. So, I mean, what a knothead this guy is. I mean, not to be disrespectful to the Pope, but he is a knothead.
But you're making a great point. We have to call out so-called Christian leaders as much as we call out political leaders. None of them are leading. There's very, very few people out there, including in the church, who are actually boldly stating what is obviously true and calling people to action. And ultimately, again, we have to look at ourselves in the mirror. We can point at Christian leaders and popes and politicians and everyone else. If we ourselves are not standing boldly for what is right and what is true and what is good, and we aren't living out our faith, then we're not Christians. Don't even call yourself a Christian. Because if truly we believe that our lives are preserved regardless of what happens to us into eternity, we have nothing to fear. And we can speak. And if you don't believe that, if you don't act upon it, then you don't have faith. And let's call it what it is. We, as the church, are responsible for our own world as it is. And we've been irresponsible. Mm-hmm. And that's got to change. That is the foundation on which everything else is going to be built, is a true faith grounded on the bedrock of Jesus himself and his truth. And until that happens, and until we restore our families and our friendships, all this freedom stuff is just poppycock. It's just a bunch of talk and philosophy, because it can't happen void of that foundation.
Absolutely. And I just wanted to quickly add, and I just wanted to truly emphasize that this is not we do not need a religion solution. We need a faith solution. It's not found in religious leaders. It's not found in a religious institution. It's not found in the physical structural confines of a church. It's found in God and Jesus alone. And I completely agree, John.
I'm really liking this Caitlin gal you brought on.
She's all right.
We got you like the white stuff in the Oreo cookie now, Senator.
Okay. Well, let's see. Caitlin, you want to move us into the student loan forgiveness program and what's happening there?
Sure. So basically, the facts are that the Biden administration has construed the HEROES Act to appropriate $400 billion in student loan debt. The HEROES Act was originally intended to provide financial assistance and relief to military families only. So two student loan borrowers filed suit in a federal U.S. District Court in North Texas because they were not initially granted benefits under the student loan program. And so that's how the suit came to light. And the court ultimately held that the program is illegal. It is executive overreach. There's no clear congressional authorization for the Biden administration to construe the HEROES Act. And also, this was also at the end of the order, if we allow the executive branch and executive agencies to just continue to read in their own wild interpretations of statutes and just continue to add on to these statutes, then we're living under the tyranny of the executive. Why even have Congress? Why have these other branches? So that's ultimately what the court found. So right now there is an injunction against that program, and it is not in effect at this moment.
Yeah, I read through the court decision. It's very, very compelling, very well drafted opinion, and a couple of the things that I thought were worthy of mentioning. The court said, "We are not ruled by an all-powerful executive with a pen and a phone. Instead, we're ruled by a constitution that provides for three distinct and independent branches of government. As President James Madison warned, the accumulation of all powers, legislative, executive, judiciary, in the same hands may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny." And that's from the Federalist number 47. The the founders recognized that men are very flawed. They tend to seek power and advantage. And for that reason, they set up a separation of powers under the Constitution, where we have the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. Each of those deliberately designed to tug and pull against the other. And the problem that we have is that there has been an increasing tendency for the executive to morph into an all-powerful, almost dictatorial force. And as the court pointed out, they have taken some minor language from this heroes statute and used that as a mechanism to essentially enact a law that forgives $400 billion in student loan obligations. And one of the terms used by the court is that agencies may not seek to hide elephants in mouse holes. And what they were saying is that here you had some trivial little mention in a statute, which was not a huge statute, and all of a sudden you're taking what the court said was undeniably the greatest legislative enactment by the executive branch in history, where they were using what they interpreted as delegated authority from Congress and exploded it into some monstrous measure that really affected even the national debt. It was so large. And
do you really think that Biden really thought this was going to stand up to the courts? I mean, it was such a reach from the get-go. Or was this just another vote buying exercise? Because it's really interesting that this court case came out right after the election.
I think you've really hit it on the head. I think he knew it was unlawful, and he did it anyway. That's the problem. The Democrats are not constrained by Christian morality, and because of that, they're not constrained by the law. If they can violate the law, they'll do it.
Any means necessary. I mean, let's look at the FTX thing that just came out as well. I mean, $15 million that were laundered through Ukrainian NGOs to the Democratic Party, and it goes bankrupt the day after the election. We are seeing, again, our country has been fundamentally subverted, and its evidence is everywhere, and yet nowheres do you see real leaders saying, wait a minute, we've got to stop this. And to just acknowledge what is obviously true, that the stinking emperor has no clothes, and yet that's where we're at. And I don't know. It's really, really disturbing to recognize. I know this weekend, as time continued to go, I just the further you saw more and more evidence of it, that we're still where we were in 2020, maybe worse, it's disturbing. And we've got to be able to recognize what it is. We've been subverted. This is no different than 1933 Germany with when you have a Führer that decides he's going to throw Hindenburg to the curb and declare himself the supreme leader. Essentially, Biden's done that. Difference this time is that you got a bunch of puppets controlling Biden, and for that matter, our entire country. I mean, clearly there is something coordinated going on in all these efforts.
I think that is true. We may talk a little bit more on that cryptocurrency issue and how it's linked to the elections next time, but I think we'll need to sign off for tonight. Thank you for being with us. Focus on the news. Appreciate all of you helping us out here.